Imagine this, you're barely out of school, and suddenly you're sent to a battlefield you know nothing about. You're knee-deep in mud, surrounded by deafening explosions, and every breath feels like it might be your last. No one told you how cold it would be, how the rats would swarm, or how the fear would never leave. What was it really like to live through that? For soldiers in World War I, every moment was a fight, not just against the enemy, but against hunger, disease, and the constant weight of survival. The question is, how did anyone come out of it alive? Let's dive into the grim reality of being a soldier during World War I, a war that redefined human suffering. The trenches, those narrow, muddy ditches that stretched across Europe, became both a battlefield and a prison for millions of men. Imagine spending months in a space so small you could barely move, exposed to the elements, and constantly fearing the whistle of an incoming shell. It wasn't just about surviving, it was about enduring. The trench nightmare life in the trenches was far from what anyone could have imagined. Soldiers faced an unholy trinity of mud, blood, and death. The ground was so waterlogged that trenches often became muddy swamps, sucking the life out of every step. Boots would sink, making even the simplest movements a struggle. Nights were freezing, days were wet, and the stench, a blend of unwashed bodies, decaying flesh, and latrines, was suffocating. Rats were everywhere. These weren't ordinary rodents. They were grotesque, bloated from feeding on corpses. Soldiers spoke of rats gnawing on anything, including live soldiers, creating a constant state of anxiety. Lice plagued every man, spreading trench fever, which left soldiers bedridden for weeks. Trench foot, caused by standing in freezing, damp conditions, often led to severe infections and even amputations. The monotony of trench life was shattered by sudden violent artillery barrages. Soldiers scrambled for cover, but the trenches offered little protection. The ground quaked beneath them, dust filled the air, and the screams of the injured were a constant reminder of the ever-present danger. Every second felt like a race against time. The psychological toll. The human mind wasn't built to endure such constant stress. Shell shock, what we now call PTSD, was rampant. The deafening sound of shells falling day after day would drive men to the brink of madness. Soldiers described it as a living nightmare, where the mind would replay terrifying memories over and over. Nightmares, hallucinations, and uncontrollable trembling became common. The fear of death wasn't just limited to the battlefield. Even within the trenches, snipers could strike at any moment, picking off careless soldiers. Night raids further intensified the terror. Crawling through no man's land, soldiers faced barbed wire, enemy patrols, and the ever-looming threat of being shot or blown apart. Hunger and disease supplies were inconsistent. Soldiers often went days without proper food. The main diet consisted of hard biscuits and canned beef, which were rarely nutritious or palatable. Fresh food was a luxury, and clean water almost non-existent. Many soldiers drank from contaminated sources, leading to outbreaks of dysentery and other life-threatening diseases. This malnutrition left men weak and vulnerable to infection. Disease proved to be an even greater enemy than the battlefield. Typhoid, cholera, and influenza spread through the trenches, claiming thousands of lives. Medical care was limited, often rudimentary, and without antibiotics, even minor injuries could become fatal. The harsh combination of exhaustion, poor hygiene, and overcrowded conditions made epidemics inevitable. Alternate history. What if? Now let's take a step back and imagine. What if the world's powers had found another way to resolve their conflicts? What if World War I had never happened? Without this war, technological advancements like tanks, planes, and chemical weapons might have been delayed by decades. Millions of lives could have been spared, but how would history have unfolded? The geopolitical map would be unrecognizable. The Austro-Hungarian Empire might still exist, maintaining a fragile balance in Europe. Germany could have remained a monarchy, possibly avoiding the economic devastation and rise of extremism that followed the Treaty of Versailles. But there's another side to this scenario. What if the absence of World War I didn't prevent conflict but postponed it? Imagine a more technologically advanced and industrialized global war breaking out in the 1940s, with far deadlier consequences. A delayed conflict could have been even more catastrophic, with nuclear capabilities introduced at an earlier stage. The ripple effects would extend far beyond Europe. The colonial world might have evolved differently. Nations in Africa and Asia, whose futures were shaped by the war's aftermath, might have taken entirely different paths. The absence of this global conflict would have rewritten the 20th century in unimaginable ways. Letters from the front. One of the most heart-wrenching aspects of the war was the letters soldiers sent home. These letters served as lifelines, connecting soldiers to their families and friends. Some tried to maintain an air of normalcy, sharing mundane details to protect their loved ones from the horrors they faced. Others couldn't hide their despair. One soldier wrote, "If I don't come back, tell everyone I fought bravely. But the truth is, I'm scared every moment of every day." Another confessed, "I dream of home every night, but I fear I'll never see it again." These letters reveal the emotional toll of the war. They humanize the statistics, reminding us that behind every casualty was a person with dreams, fears, and loved ones waiting for their return. In their words, we glimpse the raw reality of a soldier's life, a blend of duty, hope, and despair. The war ends, but the scars remain. When the war finally ended in 1918, the soldiers who survived didn't just return home, they brought the war with them. Many bore physical scars, missing limbs, disfiguring injuries, chronic illnesses. But the mental wounds were often deeper. Shell shock left countless men unable to reintegrate into society. Some turned to alcohol or isolation, unable to cope with the memories. Families mourned the dead, fathers, brothers, sons who never came back. Entire communities were shattered, especially in small towns where nearly an entire generation of young men was lost. The grief wasn't just personal, it was collective. Lessons we can't ignore. World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars, but it wasn't. It taught us the devastating cost of unchecked nationalism and militarism. It showed us the resilience of the human spirit, but also its breaking point. Today, these stories remain as warnings. They remind us of the importance of diplomacy and the need to prevent history from repeating itself. Behind every soldier's story is a lesson about humanity, courage, and the cost of conflict. To be born as a soldier in World War I was to be thrust into a nightmare. It was a life of unimaginable hardship, a test of endurance against insurmountable odds. Yet these men, ordinary men, faced it with courage and determination. Their stories remind us of the true cost of war and the enduring value of peace, lessons we must carry forward for generations to come.